When you are famous, love stops being a private question and turns into public evidence. A hug becomes a headline. One late text can become front-page gossip. In Hollywood, entire careers have been built and destroyed on photos taken in the wrong bed at the wrong time. Among black legends in music and film, some were praised for their passion on stage, while being branded wild, out of control, or the one who sleeps with everyone off it. They fell in love fast, broke up even faster, and drifted through nameless affairs that left deep scars. Some insiders claimed they were addicted to sex. Others believed they were simply terrified of being alone. Maybe both could be true, because behind spotlights and love songs, they were still human beings trying to feel genuinely loved, if only for a night. In this episode, we pull open 33 case files on black legends whose love lives stunned Hollywood and fed endless rumors that they slept with everyone. What you'll see isn't just scandal. It's a pattern of childhood wounds, industry pressure, and private chaos hidden behind carefully posed smiles. Richard Pryor, a genius who tried to laugh away the void. In 1970, as Hollywood, Richard Pryor was the name that could make an entire room double over with laughter, and at the same time make producers nervous about what he might say next. He was a brutal, brilliant comic who turned the pain of black people and the working poor into jokes sharp enough to cut through any polite silence. But away from the stage lights, Richard lived in a different universe, a world thick with cigarette smoke, cocaine residue, and relationships that began and ended before dawn. People in his circle said Pryor could fall for anyone, men, women, or anyone bold enough to step close to his orbit. Stories circulated from all-night parties where he cracked jokes with one arm around a fellow star of the same sex, not bothering to hide. Later, Richard himself addressed the rumors in interviews, half joking, half confessing. He famously remarked that he loved people regardless of gender, as long as they didn't touch his cocaine. That kind of line shook the press and fascinated the public. His love life, like his stand-up, was tangled, wild, and sometimes painfully self-destructive. Underneath the chaos was an insecure heart. A childhood surrounded by violence and instability had pushed him toward drugs and sex as temporary anesthetics. The binges, the sleepless nights, the faces he couldn't remember in the morning, all of it was an attempt to patch a hole that never really closed. In rare moments of reflection, late in his life, Richard admitted that he hadn't really been chasing love. He had been running from the terror of being alone. People called him wild, reckless, impossible. But no one could honestly say he wasn't living his truth, even when that truth burned him from the inside out. The world laughed with him, but there was always a hint of pity for a man who could make everyone forget their pain while never escaping his own. Marvin Gaye searching for God in forbidden embraces. No one sang about love quite like Marvin Gaye. His voice floated somewhere between prayer and confession, caught between the light of soul music and the shadows of desire. On stage, he seemed like the perfect romantic figure, calm, intense, his eyes carrying stories that never made it into words. Offstage, Marvin was often portrayed as a man running from himself, using music, sex, and temporary romances as hiding places. Stories about his lovers are everywhere, colleagues, models, women who belonged to other men. In his private writings, he admitted he was addicted to the feeling of being desired. For him, every new relationship was like a fresh song, every breakup a new craving he couldn't shake. But that craving had roots. Marvin grew up in a strictly religious home, with a father who preached morality with one hand, and according to multiple accounts used the other to punish brutally. Living under that roof taught Marvin that desire was dangerous, and that failing to be good would bring down God's wrath. When he couldn't live up to the rules, he chose the opposite role, sinner. At least in sin, he felt a twisted kind of freedom. The press labeled him obsessed with the flesh, but the truth was more complicated. He wasn't glorifying lust, he was fighting it and losing over and over. The more he feared it, the deeper he fell into it, like a man trying to burn out his own urges by standing in the fire. In 1984, when his father shot and killed him, the world didn't just lose a voice. It lost a man who had spent his entire life trapped between the pulpit and the bedroom, between faith and instinct. Marvin Gaye sang of love, mercy, and change, but some say he never found enough of any of them for himself. Rick James, the king of funk, who became a warning. Rick James stormed into the 1980 like a neon hurricane. With its like Super Freak and Give It To Me Baby, he helped define funk rock's wildest era. Long braids, glittering outfits, and grooves that felt like a dare, Rick didn't just perform excess, he became its unofficial mascot. But his private life wasn't just wild, it was dangerous. Friends and biographers have described his home as a non-stop party zone, a place where drugs, especially crack cocaine, flowed like tap water. Week-long benders, endless guests, and a constant blur between pleasure and aggression turned his house into something closer to a trap than a sanctuary. The fun ended the moment the criminal cases began to surface. Women came forward with accusations of horrific abuse while he was under the influence. The most infamous case came in 1993, when he was convicted for holding a woman hostage and torturing her over several days while high on cocaine. These were not just bad headlines, they were crimes that could not be explained away by rock and roll lifestyle. Overnight, the image of the fearless funk king was overshadowed by something much darker. He went from youth idol to a public symbol of self-destruction and brutality. Prison time followed. Many in the music community turned their backs. His legacy as an innovator was buried beneath the weight of his own actions. Even at rock bottom, Rick James managed to stir controversy. Interviews and appearances hinted at a man who knew he'd destroyed much of what he'd built, but who never fully escaped the demons that drove him there. When he died in 2004, it was a painful reminder that genius and ruin can coexist in one person, and that talent cannot erase the harm a person inflicts on others. Tina Turner, a queen who walked through hell and kept going. Tina Turner, the undisputed queen of rock and roll, built a career on fire. Her voice was rough and powerful, her stage presence explosive, her energy seemingly endless. In the early days, she shared the spotlight with her husband, Ike Turner, creating R&B and soul classics that redefined what a live performance could feel like. To the public, they were a powerhouse duo. Behind closed doors, Tina was living in a nightmare. According to her own accounts and multiple witnesses, Ike's control went far beyond music. He beat her, humiliated her, and dragged her into a world of drugs and sex that revolved around his needs, not hers. She described being forced to attend his parties, nights where his psychological and physical dominance reached its peak, designed to break her spirit. When Tina finally found the courage to escape and file for divorce, she didn't just walk out of a marriage, she walked into a war with public perception. Some doubted her, others questioned why she hadn't left sooner. But as she began to tell her story in interviews and later in her memoir, the world saw the pattern clearly: a woman whose brilliance had been both used and punished by the man closest to her. That marriage became a textbook example of domestic violence, hidden behind a glamorous act. Yet Tina did not stay in the role of victim. She rebuilt her career from almost nothing, touring relentlessly, crafting new hits, and reinventing herself as a solo powerhouse. Her life became not just a music biography, but a survival manual. Tina Turner's legacy is more than a stack of gold records. It's proof that enduring abuse is not destiny, and that walking away, even when you're bruised, broken, doubted, can lead to a higher peak than the one your abuser promised you. She didn't just survive Ike Turner. She outshone him so completely that in many minds she now stands alone as the true royalty of that story. Ike Turner, the architect who became the cautionary tale. Ike Turner helped shape the early sound of rock and roll and soul. With sharp instincts for rhythm and arrangement, he pioneered electric-driven R&B and set the stage for artists who came after him. As one half of Ike and Tina Turner, he played a major role in building a show that tore up stages around the world. But the file on Ike's personal life is long and ugly. Accounts from Tina, and others close to them, describe a man consumed by control, cocaine, and rage. His addiction, allegedly fed a personality that swung between charm and cruelty, leaving those around him walking on broken glass. Reports and legal records detail years of physical and emotional abuse toward Tina and accusations from others of sexual violence and coercion. Offstage, his life was marked by chaotic relationships. It was said that he fathered many children with different women, leaving behind a trail of complicated families and unresolved pain. His brilliant ear for music couldn't cover the pattern of harm. As the truth about his behavior became public, Ike's image shifted from pioneer to emblem of the worst kind of power abuse in the industry. For decades, he faced boycotts and widespread condemnation. Critics and fans struggled and often refused to separate his musical innovations from the violence he inflicted. When Ike Turner died, some tributes tried to highlight his role in music history. But the shadow of what he did in his private life never lifted. He remains a reminder that a person can help build an entire genre and still devastate the people closest to them, and that no amount of artistic genius can erase the damage of unchecked power and addiction. James Brown, the godfather of soul, who couldn't control his own house. James Brown, the godfather of soul, built an empire out of rhythm and raw energy. He rose from harsh poverty to become one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, shaping funk and modern popular music. On stage, he was unstoppable splits, spin, sweat, and a commanding shout that made whole arenas move as one. He became a symbol of black pride and self-made success, proof that someone from nothing could change the sound of the world. But the file on James Brown's private life reads very differently. Behind closed doors, his relationships were marked by control violence and a long trail of betrayals. Alongside arrests and reports of domestic abuse, he was known for decades of infidelity, moving from one affair to another. Dancers in his band, secretaries, devoted fans, many of them became part of stories that would later surface as painful confessions. For James, it was said that serial infidelity was just part of being a star, a right he believed came with fame. But the public wasn't blind. When accusations of abuse and repeated incidents of violence at home became public record, fans were forced to confront a disturbing contradiction. The man who wrote songs about respect and empowerment was by many accounts causing fear inside his own family. Women's rights groups and critics condemned him. His legend on stage remained, but the image of the hero cracked sharply. By the time he died in 2006, James Brown left behind a legacy divided in two halves: the genius who lifted millions with his music, and the man who couldn't stop harming those closest to him. His story stands as a harsh line between artistic greatness and catastrophic failure of character. Little Richard, the rebel, torn between freedom and faith. Little Richard wasn't just part of rock and roll, he was one of the sparks that lit it on fire. With wild piano runs, piercing vocals, glittering suits, and sky-high hair, he brought chaos, joy, and rebellion to a world still clinging to stiff rules. His presence was androgynous, flamboyant, and unapologetic, the kind of performance that made teenagers scream and elders shake their heads in outrage. His personal life mirrored that intensity. Little Richard admitted openly that he joined wild parties in the early days of rock and roll, exploring sex with men and women, and collapsing boundaries wherever he went. He treated sex as liberation, a way to reject the shame and silence he'd grown up with. Yet at the same time, he described it as the devil's joke, revealing a deep conflict between his desires and the strict religious teachings that shaped him as a child. He swung like a pendulum between extremes. One moment he was living in full rebellion: drugs, sex, and stage shows that dared anyone to tell him to tone it down. The next he was renouncing rock and roll, announcing repentance, and returning to the church as a preacher. Each confession, each public statement about his sex life and drug use stirred controversy and fascination in equal measure. Little Richard's life became a long, loud argument between his faith and his freedom. In his later years, he tried to find peace between the two, speaking about both God and rock and roll in the same breath. He remains a symbol of liberation and inner conflict, a man who opened doors for generations of outsiders, while never fully resolving the war inside his own soul. Miles Davis, a jazz genius whose home became a hidden crime scene. Miles Davis sits near the top of any serious list of jazz legends. With a horn that could sound like a whisper or a wound, he reshaped the genre again and again from cool jazz to fusion and beyond. He was the image of controlled, cool, a band leader who pulled new sounds out of silence and pushed musicians to follow him into uncharted territory. But the private Miles Davis, by his own later admissions, was far from cool. His life offstage was soaked in drugs, volatile temper, and relationships that turned violent behind closed doors. He was known for passionate affairs with dancers, models, and fellow artists, but many of those relationships came with outbursts that left lasting damage. In his memoir, Miles admitted plainly that he hit women, turning his home into a place of fear for the partners who once thought they were safe with him. Those admissions forced fans and critics into an uncomfortable position. They could not deny the brilliance of Kind of Blue or his other masterpieces, but they also could not look away from the violence he described. The split in how people saw him never fully healed. Some tried to separate art from artist, others refused to do so at all. Miles Davis's death left behind a vast catalogue of music that still inspires and a personal story that still troubles. His life is a reminder that someone can give the world beauty through their art and still create deep wounds in their own home, and genius alone can't repair the harm done. Sam Cooke, the king of soul, whose end exposed a double life. Sam Cooke was the smooth, golden voice who helped invent soul music as we know it. He brought gospel phrasing into pop crafting classics, like A Change Is Gonna Come and Wonderful World. For many, he represented success, elegance, and hope, especially for Black Americans dreaming of breaking through barriers in music and business. He was not just an artist, he was a savvy businessman who fought hard to own his masters and control his career. Behind that polished image, though, was a private life filled with secrets. Sam was known for pursuing women wherever he went, and business trips often doubled as opportunities for hidden affairs. He had a reputation as a ladies' man who rarely turned down attention, weaving a web of relationships that few people knew the full extent of while he was alive. The tragedy of his death in 1964 shattered the carefully managed image. He was killed at a small motel in Los Angeles, reportedly naked and in the presence of a sex worker, under circumstances that remain debated and disturbing to this day. The stock details the location, the state he was found in, the conflicting accounts stunned the public. The King of Soul, who sang about change and dignity, suddenly appeared in headlines as another star undone by his own desires. For many, the story of his death complicated how they heard his music. The noble, hopeful themes of his songs now sat beside a narrative of secret chaos and vulnerability. Sam Cooke's life and death became a reminder that even the most inspiring voices can be entangled in self-destructive patterns they never manage to escape. Billie Holiday, a voice hunted by systems and haunted by pain. Billie Holiday, Lady Day, sang like she was carrying centuries of sorrow in every phrase. Her voice was smoky, fragile, and devastating, turning songs like Strange Fruit into weapons against racism and brutality. She was not just a vocalist, she was a witness, making people feel what they preferred to ignore. But the life behind that voice was an unending spiral of hurt. From an early age, Billie carried trauma and drugs, became a sedative for pain she couldn't outrun. She became addicted, and the law followed. Police and authorities did not treat her as a sick person who needed help, but as a target. Arrests, raids, and bans from performing in clubs, especially in New York, turned her career into a battlefield. Her relationships were as tangled as her legal record. She loved men and women, including fellow musicians and figures tied to the underworld. For Billie, sex and drugs became temporary shelter from loneliness and fear. But that shelter always collapsed, leaving her more exposed than before. Authorities monitored her relentlessly. She was in many ways punished, both for her addiction and for daring to sing about lynching and racial violence in a country that wanted silence. When she died at just 44, she was in a hospital room under police guard, with barely anything to her name. Billie Holiday's story is one of a fragile, fierce voice that soothed millions, yet never found lasting peace for itself. She remains an echo of how a sensitive soul can be broken by both personal demons and a system determined to control her. Etta James singing about love while trying to fill a bottomless void. Etta James, with that raw, aching voice, turned love songs into confessions. Her performances in soul and blues made her an icon, but her offstage story was just as intense, one she would later describe with startling honesty. She openly spoke about struggling with sex addiction, describing a lifetime of chaotic relationships and a relentless quest to feel wanted. Abandoned by her mother and scarred by childhood instability, she learned early to use sex as a way to fill emotional holes that nothing else seemed to touch. The more she chased relief, the more trouble she found. Her addiction to sex came hand in hand with drug dependency, forming a cycle that shocked the public and damaged her health. Legal issues, stints in rehab, and periods of physical decline made headlines, casting a shadow over the brilliant musician fans adored. Some judged her harshly. Others saw her as a woman, trying and often failing to cope with pain that began long before fame. Through it all, Etta James poured those wounds into her music. When she sang about love, loss, and longing, she wasn't just performing, she was testifying. Her songs became a way to tell the truth about unhealed hurt in a world that preferred neat, polished stories. Etta James will always be remembered as more than a powerful voice. She was a storyteller who refused to pretend her scars didn't exist, using every note to show how love, addiction, and trauma can twist together in a life that the outside world only thinks it understands. Marvin Gaye, sir. The preacher who destroyed the song. Marvin Gaye, sir, stood in the pulpit as a preacher wrapped in the language of holiness and discipline. To the outside world, he was the stern spiritual head of the family, the man who laid down the rules. But inside the house, behind closed doors, his image cracked. Stories from those years describe a man who ruled through fear, not love, a father whose strictness spilled over into physical and emotional abuse. His private life was tangled in its own hypocrisy. While preaching morality, he was said to be involved in extramarital affairs, a secret life that contradicted everything he claimed to stand for. The home he controlled became a place of tension and dread, especially for his son, Marvin Gaye Jr., who carried those wounds into adulthood. The violence and instability in that house carved deep psychological scars into the future soul legend. The same man who would one day sing about mercy and love was as a child living in constant fear of the person meant to protect him. The final unforgivable act came in 1984. After years of conflict, Marvin Gaye Sr. shot and killed his own son during an argument, a moment that exposed the entire family's buried chaos to the world. The man who had presented himself as righteous became, in the eyes of millions, the destroyer of a legacy. It was a brutal reminder that some of the deepest wounds artists carry begin at home, in rooms where no cameras are allowed. Ray Charles, a genius, tangled in his own family tree. Ray Charles, the genius, rewrote music history with his fusion of gospel, R&B, and pop. Blind from a young age, he turned sound into a universe of its own, building an empire of songs that could make people dance, cry, or both in the same track. On stage, he was a master, charismatic, playful, and untouchable behind the piano. Off stage, his love life was a maze. Ray was open about his appetite for women. While married, he carried on affairs with singers in his band Women he met on tour and admirers who crossed his path on the road. For him, according to many who knew him, having multiple lovers seemed like just another piece of the superstar life. The consequences were enormous. Ray fathered at least a dozen children, with multiple women, leaving behind a family tree so wide and complex that even he, at times, seemed overwhelmed by it. The emotional and financial weight of those relationships followed him for years. Fans loved his music, but his personal life forced them to confront another side of the icon, a man driven as much by instinct and desire as by artistic vision. He left the world with a towering musical legacy and a tangled personal history that showed how even a genius can be pulled in every direction by his own impulses. Jackie Wilson, Mr. Excitement who couldn't calm the chaos. Jackie Wilson, nicknamed Mr. Excitement, could electrify a stage like few others. His powerful voice, sharp dance moves, and magnetic charm made him a pivotal figure in early soul and R&B, an artist who helped shape what modern pop performance looks like. But while his performances were tightly choreographed, his personal life was anything but. Jackie was notorious for his womanizing. He had lovers in the open and others hidden in the shadows, relationships that often overlapped and collided. Jealous confrontations were common, some spilling into public scenes that drew the attention of tabloids and police alike. He fathered children outside his marriage, adding strain to an already unstable home life. The scandals painted him not just as a star, but as an irresponsible man whose choices left emotional wreckage behind. His career ended in tragedy. His health failing after a collapse on stage left him severely impaired. Jackie Wilson remains a legend on the mic and the dance floor, but his life also stands as a cautionary story about how unmanaged desire and denial can destroy everything an artist works for. Otis Redding, a voice of pure soul with a hidden fracture. Otis Redding's voice sounded like it was carved straight from the heart, raw, pleading, endlessly soulful. Songs like Try a Little Tenderness turned him into an icon of sincerity and emotional depth. To the public, he was the very image of true love and devotion in song. In private, things were more complicated. Though married, Otis was known to have affairs while out on tour, relationships that contradicted the faithful image many fans projected onto him. For years, these secrets stayed mostly in the background, overshadowed by his rapid rise in music. Everything changed after his death in a plane crash in 1967. As the world mourned, more details surfaced, including the revelation that he had fathered a child with another woman shortly before he died. That disclosure cracked his carefully held halo, forcing admirers to reconcile the devoted voice on the records with the less tidy truth of the man's life. Otis Redding is still celebrated for his enormous contributions to soul, but his story underscores a familiar pattern. Even the artists who sound like they're singing about pure love can be wrestling with betrayal in their own lives. Barry White, the maestro of romance trapped in his own image. Barry White's voice was practically a shorthand for seduction, deep, velvety, and unmistakably sensual. His music soundtracked countless romantic nights, earning him the image of a smooth, irresistible ladies' man. On record covers and stages, he looked every bit the king of slow-burning passion. Offstage, he leaned into that persona. Barry lived as a self-styled Casanova with multiple relationships often overlapping. Even while married, he was known for pursuing other women, his life surrounded by parties, luxury, and public displays of wealth and affection. Critics and moralists pointed to his behavior as reckless and irresponsible, especially toward his official family and children. But many fans folded the scandals into his myth, seeing his womanizing as part of the character. He'd built the romantic heavyweight, whose entire career revolved around love and desire. Barry White remains a legend of sensual music, a man whose songs still play at weddings and quiet dinners. Yet behind that seductive glow was someone who struggled to align his private actions with the romantic ideals he sold to the world. Jimi Hendrix, the guitar god, who burned from both ends. Jimi Hendrix changed what a guitar could say. With feedback distortion and an almost otherworldly sense of melody, he reinvented rock music in just a few short years. On stage, he looked like electricity given human form, wild clothes, explosive solos, and performances that felt like rituals. Offstage, his life followed the same reckless momentum. Jimmy's days and nights blurred into cycles of drugs, heavy drinking, and fleeting encounters. He was known for having hundreds of brief affairs with parties that became notorious for their combination of music intoxication and sex. After his death, at 27 photos and footage, emerged that gave the public a more unfiltered look at his private excesses. The images showed a man living without breaks, adored exhausted and steadily eroding. People still worship his talent, but many also see the tragedy in how quickly he burned through his own life. Jimi Hendrix's story is a sharp reminder that the line between creative brilliance and self-destruction can be impossibly thin, and once it's crossed, there's rarely a way back. Prince turning desire into doctrine. Prince Rogers Nelson turned sex, spirituality, and sound into his own universe. With his androgynous image, high heels, lace, and fearless lyrics, he pushed the boundaries of what an artist could say and look like. He made sensuality central to his music, turning desire into something almost ceremonial. His personal life carried the same aura, passionate, mysterious, and constantly talked about. Prince had a series of high-profile relationships with famous women, from musicians to actresses. Stories and rumors circulated about parties that mirrored his explicit lyrics, places where he tested the limits of the fantasies he put on records. Conservative groups condemned him, accusing him of corrupting youth and glorifying lust. Meanwhile, many fans hailed him as a prophet of sexual freedom, someone who gave them permission to explore identity and desire without shame. Prince died, leaving behind a massive, sensuous artistic legacy and a reputation as one of music's most enigmatic figures. He remains the artist who turned longing into gospel and pleasure into philosophy, and who in his own way spent a lifetime trying to find love inside the very freedom he preached. Rick James and Tina Marie, a duet of brilliance and self-destruction. Rick James and Tina Marie were a force in 1980s funk and R&B, a musical duo whose chemistry felt volcanic, both in the studio and on stage. But the bond that powered their hits was also tied to a lifestyle that teetered constantly on the edge. They didn't hide how they lived. Together, they moved through a world of heavy cocaine use, excess, and what many described as reckless, boundary-pushing sex. Stories of group encounters and marathon parties followed them, painting a picture of two people riding the same dangerous wave. Their relationship fed their music, but also their addictions. What looked from a distance like a perfect artistic pairing was up close a spiral of extremes. The drugs, the chaos, and the emotional volatility hit both of their careers and their health, leaving scars that never fully healed. Rick James and Tina Marie's story shows how what looks like chemistry can sometimes be two people sharing the same darkness. They were a duet of genius and excess, proving that the same fire that makes great art can also burn everything around it. Isaac Hayes, soul royalty, pulled by instinct. Isaac Hayes, with his deep voice, shaved head, and dramatic arrangements, became an icon of soul and soundtrack history. His work on Shaft and his lush extended songs turned him into a symbol of cool, confident black masculinity in the 1970s. In private, he embraced an extremely liberal view of love and relationships. Isaac was known for having multiple partners at once, fans, co-workers, assistants, and admirers who were drawn in by his charisma and fame. Affairs overlapped, secrets piled up, and his marriages struggled under the weight of his choices. For Isaac, the attention from women seemed like confirmation of his star power. But the complications it created in his family life and among his children were real and lasting. His name continues to be spoken with respect in music circles, but his personal life remains a case study in how unchecked desire can complicate everything, even for someone at the top. Isaac Hayes remains a towering musical figure, an artist who brought richness and depth to soul. At the same time, he stands as a reminder of how hard it is to balance instinct, fame, and responsibility without breaking something important. Eartha Kitt, loving dangerously in a segregated world. Eartha Kitt was more than a singer or actress. She was a presence. With her distinctive voice, sharp wit, and feline charm, she became an icon of sensuality and defiance. But her personal relationships, especially with powerful men, came at a high price. In both the United States and Europe, Eartha was rumored to have relationships with politicians and influential figures. These were not always simple love affairs. In a world stacked against black women, especially during segregation and the Cold War era, such relationships could be a means of survival and access. Her bluntness made her enemies. She spoke openly about politics, war, and injustice, even confronting power directly, like when she criticized U.S. policy at a White House event. These choices, paired with whispers about her private life, led to her being effectively blacklisted in the U.S. for nearly a decade. Work dried up. Doors closed. Eartha Kitt chose her own voice over comfort and paid for it with lost opportunities. She remains a symbol of resilience, someone who refused to bow to expectations, even when it cost her so much. Her life shows how, for a black woman in that era, love, survival, and political courage were often tangled together. Diana Ross, a diva paying the price of perfection. Diana Ross rose to stardom as the face of the Supremes, and then as a solo icon, her image carefully crafted to embody elegance, control, and perfection. She became one of Motown's brightest stars, the kind of figure the label put forward as proof that black artists could dominate not just charts, but culture itself. Behind the scenes, her emotional life was more complicated. Diana's name was often linked to romantic rumors, many involving colleagues at Motown. One of the most enduring stories was her long-rumored relationship with Motown founder Berry Gordy. For years, it was whispered that she had a child with him outside of marriage, a fact long kept hidden to protect both their images and careers. The pressure to appear flawless weighed heavily on her. She had to guard her privacy fiercely, knowing that even a hint of improper romance could jeopardize everything she had built in a world that judged black women more harshly than anyone else. Diana Ross remains a revered diva, still celebrated for her voice and poise. But her story also illustrates what it costs to maintain a perfect image, especially when it means hiding truths about love and family in order to survive an unforgiving industry. Smokey Robinson, the romantic who couldn't live his own lyrics. Smokey Robinson wrote some of the most tender romantic songs in Motown history, tracks that painted love as patient, honest, and true. He cultivated a clean, devoted image, the gentle poet of Motown, a family man whose songs could be trusted. The reality was more conflicted. While publicly embodying fidelity, Smokey privately lived a double life. He later admitted to having a long-term affair that resulted in a child with another woman, while he was still married. When the truth surfaced, it struck fans and colleagues hard, shattering the carefully maintained picture of him as unshakably loyal. The scandal forced people to confront the gap between his lyrics and his life. The man who had built his career on idealized love was struggling with the same weaknesses and temptations as anyone else. He had just managed to hide it longer. Smokey Robinson is still recognized as a songwriting genius who gave the world some of its most enduring love songs. But his story also serves as a quiet reminder: even the most trusted voices can carry secrets that don't match the stories they sing. Aretha Franklin, the Queen, whose power was built on buried pain. Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, embodied strength every time she stepped up to a microphone. Her voice demanded respect, turned gospel into thunder, and made her a symbol of black power and womanhood. Yet her private life was marked by deep and early trauma. She had her first child at just 12 years old, an experience she rarely spoke about in public, but one that followed her for the rest of her life. Her relationships were complex, including broken marriages, intense affairs, and rumors of infidelity that never fully went away. The media was relentless in chasing her personal story, trying to pierce the armor of a woman who preferred to keep her pain private. The contrast between her onstage image, regal in control, and the vulnerable reality underneath only widened as time went on. Aretha channeled that suffering into her music, pouring raw emotion into every line. She showed that greatness is often laid on a foundation of unresolved hurt. The world saw a queen. Few understood the full weight of what she carried beneath the crown. Whitney Houston, the angelic voice swallowed by the noise. Whitney Houston arrived as close to perfection as pop culture ever allows a voice, like no other polished image, a promise of purity. For years she was marketed as the untouchable diva, the standard against which everyone else was measured. But her personal life told another story. Behind the scenes, Whitney struggled with addiction and a chaotic emotional world. Rumors circulated about a deep, complicated relationship with a close female assistant, a love many believed she was never allowed to fully claim in public. Her high-profile marriage to Bobby Brown introduced new layers of turmoil, including heavy drug use and spiraling behavior. The tabloids feasted on her downfall, documenting weight loss, erratic interviews, and public incidents that clashed violently with her once angelic image. Fans watched in disbelief as the woman who'd once seemed flawless appeared increasingly fragile and lost. Her death was the tragic closing act in a life that had been slowly unraveling in front of millions. Whitney Houston remains the voice of a generation, but her story is also a stark warning about what fame pressure and unresolved inner battles can do to a human being, even one who once seemed untouchable. Marvin Sease, the man who brought desire straight into the church's shadow. Marvin Sease was a soul blues singer who made his name by refusing to censor himself. With lyrics that were openly explicit and often shocking, he blurred the lines between gospel roots and secular desire. Some called him the king of erotic soul. Others labeled him a provocateur who had crossed a sacred line. His songs didn't hint at sex, they confronted it directly. In his private life, he was rumored to live much like his music sounded, surrounded by sensuality parties and a deliberately provocative presence that pushed against religious norms. For his supporters, Marvin was brave, a man refusing to hide the realities of human desire. For his critics, especially in conservative religious communities, he was an offender who had defiled something holy. The arguments around him were never just about music. They were about what was allowed to be said out loud. Marvin Sease's legacy is that of a talented outlier who forced listeners to face the tension between faith and flesh. He didn't resolve that contradiction. He just sang it as loudly and unapologetically as he could. Chaka Khan, turning personal storms into sonic power. Chaka Khan, the queen of funk and soul, has a voice that sounds like raw energy made human. She became an icon of female strength, with songs that felt like declarations of survival and self-worth. Behind the anthems, she battled her own demons. Chaka has spoken openly about her struggles with addiction to drugs and at times to chaotic relationships. Sex and substances became ways to numb loneliness and cope with the crushing expectations placed on her as a star. Her love life was marked by intense, sometimes messy affairs that fed the tabloids and disappointed fans who wanted their heroes flawless. Periods of rehab and instability interrupted her career, forcing her to repeatedly rebuild both her health and her reputation. Yet Chaka Khan refused to stay down. She turned the chaos into fuel, drawing from the same pain that nearly destroyed her to give her performances even more depth. She stands as a survivor, proof that it's possible to come back from the edge and transform personal disaster into something powerful enough to uplift others. Grace Jones, the blade that cut through every rule. Grace Jones didn't just break the mold, she shattered it and then wore the pieces as jewelry. With her angular looks, androgynous style, and fearless performances, she redefined what a black woman, a model, a singer, and an artist could look like. In the 1970 S and ADS, she stood in the center of a cultural storm, daring the world to look away. Her personal life was as free as her image. Grace was openly bisexual and unapologetic about her enjoyment of sex, partying at legendary spots, like Studio 54, where nights could stretch into mornings without a hint of regret. She refused to apologize for any of it, treating her life as an extension of her art. Conservative society was scandalized. But for many, especially queer, black and gender non-conforming fans, Grace Jones became a hero, someone who embodied the possibility of living without bowing to expectations. She remains an unrepeatable icon, a living reminder that some people don't just bend boundaries, they erase them and replace them with their own rules. Lena Horne, loving across a forbidden line. Lena Horne was one of Hollywood's earliest black superstars, a stunning singer and actress whose very presence challenged segregation-era casting. Behind the carefully groomed studio image, though her love life was full of risks that could have ended her career. During a time of intense racial segregation, Lena was involved with powerful white men producers and other influential figures. These relationships were not only emotionally charged, they were dangerous. Crossing the color line in love could end contracts, invite government scrutiny, and ruin reputations overnight. Gossip and suspicion followed her. Some saw her relationships as strategic, a way to survive in an industry designed to keep her out. Others judged her harshly, unable or unwilling to see the impossible choices available to a black woman in that era. She lived under constant constraint, often unable to publicly acknowledge the full truth of her heart. Lena Horne fought for equality while navigating a romantic life tightly bound by the politics of race and power. Her story is a quiet, painful record of what it cost to love and work in one of America's darkest social periods. Josephine Baker Freedom in Feathers and Flesh. Josephine Baker became a legend in Paris long before much of America accepted her. With her bold, often provocative performances, she turned stages into battlegrounds for liberation, dancing, singing, and existing as a black woman in ways that shattered stereotypes and delighted audiences. Her personal life mirrored that sense of freedom. Josephine was open about her relationships with both men and women, living as if traditional rules simply did not apply to her. She moved through romances, across race and class lines, treating love and sex as natural expressions of human connection, not boxes to be checked or policed. The world responded with a mix of fascination and outrage. Some labeled her immoral. Others saw her as the embodiment of modern liberation. Beyond the scandal, Josephine Baker fought as a spy for the French resistance and a civil rights activist, proving that the same courage she brought to the stage fueled her fight for justice. She remains a symbol of absolute freedom, a woman who refused to let anyone or any system tell her how to live or whom to love. Pam Grier, the action heroine who owned her story. Pam Grier broke into Hollywood as a force of nature. In the 1970s, she became the face of tough, sensual, gun-toting heroines who fought back in a world determined to box black women into submissive roles. Her on-screen presence was bold and unapologetic. Off-screen, she carried that same honesty into her love life. Pam had high-profile relationships with celebrities like comedian Richard Pryor and basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But unlike many of her peers, she did not pretend otherwise. She spoke openly about her romantic past, refusing to cloak it in false modesty. The public didn't punish her for it, they respected her. She was seen as a woman in control, someone who could love intensely without surrendering her independence or self-respect. Pam Grier remains an icon of unapologetic sexiness and strength. She changed how black women could appear in film and how they could talk about love and desire in real life, proving that vulnerability and power can exist in the same person. Donna Summer trapped inside her own spotlight. Donna Summer, the queen of disco, gave the world some of its most sensual songs. Love to Love You Baby and other hits turned her voice into the soundtrack of countless late nights, and the media quickly framed her as a symbol of sex on the dance floor. Rumors swirled about what happened backstage, tales of promiscuity and wild encounters that critics and tabloids were eager to believe. Much of it rested on an assumption: if the music was that sensual, the woman behind it must be living a chaotic, hypersexual life. The gap between Donna's public image and her true self created heavy pressure. She wrestled with being seen as nothing more than a fantasy figure and eventually turned toward faith, trying to reconcile her art, her beliefs, and the person she really was. Donna Summer's legacy is that of a pioneer in dance music, but also a woman caught between how the world wanted to see her and who she believed herself to be. Her story shows how easily a persona built for the stage can become a cage. Billy Preston brilliance, overshadowed by darkness. Billy Preston, the fifth Beatle in some circles, was a keyboard genius, who's playing elevated songs by legends. His talent was undeniable, bright, inventive, and essential to the sound of an era. His private life, however, descended into a much darker place. Billy battled addiction and found himself caught in cycles where drugs and sex overlapped in destructive ways. The darkest chapter came when he was arrested and later convicted for sexually assaulting a minor alongside drug-related charges. Those crimes shattered his public image. Fans who had admired his skill were forced to confront horrifying truths. Whatever sympathy existed for his psychological and addiction struggles could not erase the impact of what he had done. Billy Preston left behind significant musical contributions, but they now live under the heavy shadow of his actions. His story is a chilling reminder that untreated trauma and addiction can twist into something devastating, and that talent does not exempt anyone from responsibility for the harm they cause. These 33 stories don't just show scandal for its own sake. They reveal a patterned genius wrapped around deep wounds, fame magnifying every impulse, and an industry ready to reward excess until it spills over